Hi, my name is Maria, and I'm a PhD student at Kyle Horton's lab at Colorado State University. And today I'm going to talk to you about the work I've been doing on analyzing the persistence and size of martin and swallow roosts in the Great Lakes region. So swallows and martins are highly specialized aerial insectivores, and some of them are very typically migratory, to the point where they are even used to mark the passage of time in some cultures. And if we think about the annual cycle of a migratory species, swallows and martins during their post-breeding migration and non-breeding period congregate in these large communal roosts that can gather thousands to hundreds of thousands of birds every day. This behavior during their post-breeding migration is usually thought of as a stopover or a staging strategy, but it's still poorly understood in their non-breeding grounds. So just to give you some examples, this is a tree swallow roost in Virginia, in the United States, and the next three roosts I'll show you are purple martin roosts. This one is in Houston, Texas. This one is in Rondônia, in Brazil. And this one is in Tocantins, also in Brazil. And even though we usually think of these roosts as being predominantly composed of one species or another, there is always some degree of mixing. And in their non-breeding grounds, for example, we know that year-round residents might join these aggregations once they start forming. Lastly, I want you to notice two things in these figures. The first one is how dense these aggregations are in the landscape. And the second one is how hard it might be to count the number of birds joining these aggregations in the field. So the main tool that I use for my research are weather radars. So if we think about a large and dense aggregation of birds in the landscape, all of them dispersing in synchrony upwards and outwards into the air at dawn, and this is usually when the radar captures them. And what we see in the radars are these sequences of donut-shaped patterns of increasing radius through time. And just some terminology, I usually call each frame that you see here as a detection, and the sequence of detections I call a track. And each track corresponds to one dispersal event in one day. And these are not hard to find if you know where the roost is. So for example, if you monitor a roost in your region, you can use one of these two tools to find them on the radar data. The first tool is called Radar Scope. It's an app that you download to your cell phone, and with it you can see real-time radar data. And a nice thing about it is that it includes radars from Environment Canada. But the disadvantage is that you have to pay $10 for it. The second tool is called Weather and Climate Toolkit. And it's an app that you download to your computer. And using it, you can access historical radar data since the beginning of the series. And Joe made a great video on how to use it to access the data. And you can just scan this QR code. But if you have questions, please let me know. So going back to my research, I wanted to leverage the full spatial and temporal power of the radar data. So I wanted to look at these 12 radar stations in the Great Lakes region across 21 years. And to do this, our collaborators from UMass developed a machine learning pipeline that is able to detect and track the roosts. But we knew that this pipeline is still detecting a lot of noise, so we developed a manual screening protocol to label the true positives, so the true roosts, and add different labels according to the level of noise. With this, we had 16,000 tracks, so 16,000 dispersal events that were the true roosts. And we did some data carpentry on it just to fix some problems with the radar sampling. And I can talk about this more later if you want. And we used the locations of these tracks as input to a mean shift clustering algorithm to find the regions of frequent use, so regions of high density of points. At this point, we throw out noisy tracks because even though they provide valuable information about the locations of the roosts, they can't be used to quantify the number of birds in these aggregations. So after all this, we have 14,000 unique dispersal events grouped into 104 clusters. And we can go back to the radar data and use radar theory to extract the number of birds in each one of the detections. And we do so by assuming that most of the birds we're looking at are purple martins, even though we know that's not exactly the case, because purple martins are the largest hirundinid in North America, and with that they produce a conservative estimate of the number of birds. So we can, with this data set, we can answer all kinds of interesting research questions. So just to give you an overview of what the data looks like, each point in this map is one different roost on one different day, and the colors represent different clusters. And we can zoom in, for example, on this roost in Lake St. Clair and look at its evolution through time. So in this animation, the different colors represent different years, and the size of the circles is proportional to the roost size. So my first question is, what is the daily distribution of roost sizes? And theoretical and empirical studies of animal aggregations have found that the distribution of group sizes across animals, different animal species, follows a common pattern. We usually find many small-sized groups and relatively rare, very large group sizes. This has been found to be true for herds of ungulates, schools of fish, and even some foraging groups of birds. And this is also what we found in the Great Lakes region. So in this plot, where we see the frequency of each group size, we can see how the majority of the roosts on the left are quite small, and there are eventually huge roosts on the right side of the plot. Notice that the y-axis is on a log scale, so the difference between the frequencies is actually quite pronounced. The fact that we found this common distribution in our study area is cool, because it might hint at a common driver of this pattern across different animal species. But this result is even more interesting if we think about the daily percentages of the population gathering in groups of each size. So let's look at it. So we can see that at the beginning of the season here, more than 60% of the population is concentrated on very small roosts. And this pattern changes in August when larger groups begin to appear. This might raise the question of what is the optimal group size and whether it changes throughout the season. So my next question is whether there is a relationship between roost size and consistency. And in this map that I'm showing you, I'm plotting only the clusters that were detected on every year that we sampled. So for 21 years, these regions were used by martins and swallows to roost. And I'll show you the answer to my question by plotting on the x-axis a region's persistence, or the number of years a region was used by birds to roost. And on the y-axis, I plot the yearly peak number of birds detected in each region. When we see the data, we can see that there is a positive relationship between these two variables, indicating that larger roosts are typically occurring in the same region throughout the years. So just going back to what I just said, some takeaways. Smaller roosts have a more important role maybe than we previously thought in the overall roosting dynamics. And larger roosts are more consistent in the landscape year after year. So some ideas for future research. I think more work is needed to understand the relationship between roost size, consistency, and fitness. I believe that these three aspects of this behavior are important drivers of the overall survival of swallows and martins during this stage of their annual cycle, and understanding them might help us better target conservation initiatives. When it comes to the radar methodology, I'm working on finding species-specific signatures on the radar data so that we can tell which species is predominant on each roost detected by the machine learning model. Lastly, because these species are transcontinental migrants, I believe we need to think about them in a transcontinental way and find ways to integrate radar data across the Americas to monitor their populations throughout their range. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.